Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This is Josh. I'm going to be your presenter today. We're here to talk about switching from QuickBooks, well, I think it's probably also known as QuickBooks Online now, to Church Windows accounting. Switching from QuickBooks to Church Windows accounting. We have a lot of customers that come to Church Windows, notably churches, of course. I mean, we're a church management software company, and we have a lot of customers that come from QuickBooks, QuickBooks Online, and to work in Church Windows accounting. And we oftentimes get a lot of questions about how that switch, transition, migration, what have you, works with regards to switching over from QuickBooks to Church Windows accounting. So, there are a lot of similarities between Church Windows accounting and QuickBooks. There are also some pretty major differences between them as well, okay? Now, I readily admit I'm not a QuickBooks tech. I've seen QuickBooks, I've looked at it, I have not worked in it extensively. I have information, I've obtained information from folks who have worked in it extensively with regards to that, but I've never had a QuickBooks account. I don't know it. So we're probably going to spend a little more time talking about Church Windows side of it than QuickBooks, because I think that probably the main thing about QuickBooks that is different from Church Windows accounting, of course, is that QuickBooks is really, I mean, there is a QuickBooks for nonprofits, but the fundamental basis of QuickBooks is that it is an accounting system that is designed for for-profit businesses, not for churches or nonprofits per se, okay? QuickBooks also has an option for either cash or accrual bookkeeping or accounting, okay? I believe it's a setting you can go in there and set in there as it, because as it does as a business accounting program, it closes all income and expenses to equity, okay? Which you choose depends on, in their software, depends on the entries that are posted in the reporting of cash revenues, okay? Now, that's kind of a really quick generalization about QuickBooks, but Church Windows accounting, of course, uses a fund accounting structure, okay? Church Windows, you might say, would be also considered a modified cash accrual system, meaning it kind of has a little bit of it can be accrual, it can be cash, or somewhere in between, okay? The treasurer's report doesn't necessarily prove cash, okay, as typically a cash system would do. Is that treasurer's report, all of the income accounts and the expenses would typically connect or match up with the cash activity as it is going in and out of our bank accounts. Now, that's not always true, but in many cases, that is the fundamental difference, is cash is the treasurer's report proves cash. And in Church Windows accounting, oftentimes that is absolutely not the case. The treasurer's report, I work with users who do that, and I don't know how they do it. I don't think they're taking advantage of the full advantage of Church Windows in terms of what it can do for you and your church, okay? But again, in a nutshell, Church Windows is a fund accounting system where you might have several equity accounts, not just one called equity or owner's equity. Before we get into some of the other stuff here, some of our reporting. QuickBooks has a balance sheet. Church Windows has a balance sheet. QuickBooks has their treasurer's or report for income expense statement, what we call, I believe, the profit and loss report. Also, they also have the statement of cash flows. Church Windows, again, has a balance sheet. Our profit and loss is the treasurer's report, and statement of cash flows is probably more in keeping with Church Windows fund activity report. And we're going to look at the fund activity report here in a little bit. All right. So I'm going to go into accounting here real quick. But before I do this, I want to go in here to our website really fast, because we're going to look at this in detail here a little bit later. But under our Resource Center page, right here under, he's waiting for the page to load. Where is it? Come on. There it is. All right. So right here under search, we type in the keyword theory, and we're going to find an option here called Accounting Fund Theory. This document right here is really, really important with regards to understanding how church windows accounting works. We don't really reference any information in here as opposed to parallels to QuickBooks, but it does talk about fund accounting. But in church windows, our balance sheet, our total assets equals total liabilities and fund balance. Accounting, while you can treat it as a cash system, is really, for all intents and purposes, an accrual or a modified accrual accounting system, cash accrual system. All right, you can, like I said, you can really, depending on how your chart of accounts is set up, you can work it more towards cash, you can work it more towards accrual, or somewhere in between, but typically somewhere in between is what I see most of the time when I'm working with my users in church windows. So if we go into our balance sheet, of course, our total assets equals our total liabilities and fund balance. It always should, and it will. And if it doesn't, you need to call me. All right? Or call one of my technicians, and we need to figure out why that is. But our total assets, whatever column that's in, beginning balance or year to date, always equals the total liabilities and fund balance at the very bottom. Okay? The assets, of course, at the top of our balance sheet, representing things and accounts that the church owns, checking accounts, savings, investment accounts, CDs, money markets, land and building, furniture and equipment, okay, or fixed assets as the case may be. Liabilities down here are monies the church owes, oftentimes payroll taxes, city and county and local taxes, state taxes, any money that's owed, loans, mortgages, things like that, even in things like accounts payable, if indeed you have balances with vendors that are entered but not yet paid. And then we get down into this section called fund balances, okay? And this is where things start to differ in terms of how things are in QuickBooks. And that is, again, QuickBooks would have equity. Church windows will have at least one equity account called a fund balance account. And in many cases, we'll have several. Okay. Each one of the income and expenses that we have on our chart of accounts are linked to one of these fund balances or equity accounts. Okay. Meanwhile, in QuickBooks, likely that would occur that they're all connected to equity. Okay. So you design the funds differently, and this is where I believe personally is that I think that the greatest challenge of when I'm working with users coming from QuickBooks is these accounts called fund balances. This is why we don't have an import function into church windows accounting, is because it is a dual entry, double entry fund accounting system, and there's really just no way that we could code building in, at least not easily, a way to be able to bring in books and accounts into church windows from a program like QuickBooks and have it work with our fund accounting structure of our software. Okay, we could certainly, I guess we could bring in one account called equity here and link all of the income and expenses to it, but that's not how our software works. All right, as a church, your fund balances are really based more on what members and visitors are designating their money and giving towards what projects or what the church is supporting, and what needs to be tracked separately. All right, so like I said, church windows may have several fund balances accounts, and this is where I begin the conversation or talk about how, as having done this for 22 plus years with churches, and say I've seen churches where they have two funds, one called undesignated funds and one called designated fund. Undesignated fund or funds and designated fund. Okay, the undesignated fund would represent their general operating fund, and the designated fund would represent everything else. And all of the income and expense accounts are linked to one of those two funds. I've also worked with churches where they've got 100 funds based on what it is that the church is tracking and what they're wanting to report separately. Each one of these fund balance accounts, with the exception of our fixed asset fund down here, has at least one income account and one expense that resolves to that actual fund balance at the end of the year, and the income and expense accounts revert to zero to start the beginning balance. Let's go look at that. So when we go into our chart of accounts here, right, I go in and I find an asset account. I go to the balance tab. Well, no, that's a bad case. Huntington Bank checking. I see a beginning balance, right? That beginning balance is the balance that I had to start the year. Again, a balance sheet account. And if I had any balances under my liability accounts, okay, like my federal 941 taxes payable, sure, I had a balance that was carried over from December that I didn't wind up paying until I got into January. Again, liability accounts that appear on my balance sheet, and similarly my fund balance accounts. However, when I go down to my income accounts here, like my general tithes and offerings, notice no beginning balance. None of my income and my expense accounts have any beginning balances. That is not their job. This is true about virtually any accounting system, folks. Okay? These accounts, income and expenses, are not meant to track or not meant to carry balances forward from one year to the next. Their purpose is to record current year's income and expense activity only, and perhaps, retain or have a budget to compare them to. Okay? Let's go quickly kind of back here. I hope I didn't close that. Good. Understanding fund accounting software. This is really where, we are kind of getting into the nuts and bolts of talking about how fund accounting is different from a for-profit accounting system, okay, is understanding, at least as far as Church Windows is concerned, is what do you mean fund accounting? Because a lot of times folks are really confused about that, okay? And that is, again, the difference right here. And it talks about, let me get out my highlighter here and kind of briefly cover this real quick, is, when you receive $100, if you give $100 to the church and the person says, I want that $100 to be applied to the electric bill, if the church wants to accept that money, they have to honor that request. Okay? And that's where things get to be tricky. And I'm talking about this section right here, folks, is where that's talking about that. And that's fundamentally the real difference between that, because when somebody gives a sizable gift, the church will say maybe they'll be tracking or supporting that project, but they want to, and they want to accept the money, but maybe they're not ready to work on it or do, begin working on that project at this very minute. So maybe that money needs to be stored and retained and tracked into a future year. So that's where funds come into play. Is funds are monies that are pots of money that are kept separate from other fund monies, and that have their own income accounts and their own expenses, and they will carry balances forward from one year to the next. Okay? And it says right here, word fund. Confusing part about setting up a fund account in an accounting system is understanding the word fund itself. A fund is not an asset account. It can be represented by an asset account. Okay? I have designed my chart of accounts in such a way where my general checking account exclusively manages and handles the money in my general fund balance account. And I have a savings account that is exclusively representing or handling the money in my building fund, and another asset account for a different fund, okay? You can construct and set up your chart of accounts in such a way where you do have a 1-to-1 ratio of assets to funds. I've got 6 asset accounts, I've got 6 funds, okay? As long as you understand that that is not the way that the software doesn't require it to be that way, okay? And it shows us down here under the chart of accounts under this document here about, general fund, and then we've got all of the income and expenses linked to it down here, and it talks about the flow of money, and here we are down into our assets equaling liabilities and fund balance. And this section right here under the 5th page of this kind of talks about different ways in which funds can be constructed, Okay. As I said, I've worked with a lot of folks coming over from QuickBooks over the course of the years. And as I've said, I think that their greatest challenge always when coming to a fund accounting system is, well, what kind of funds or what do we set up for our funds? That's a really, really open-ended question. And I say start simply. Start out with a basic general operating fund. Then set up another one called designated fund. And as you determine what kind of money needs to be tracked separately or kept separate for reporting purposes, you can then go in and add additional funds and move and shift money around into these different funds as you begin to become familiar with and understand how fund accounting and church windows accounting works. Okay. As I said, if you choose to set up one fund in your chart of accounts and call it general operating fund and link every income and expense to it, by all means, go ahead and do that. But just be aware you will probably not be harnessing the full power that church windows accounting offers you. Okay. Before fund accounting programs like our software became more widely accepted, when a church wanted to track money separately or when it became an accounting practice or theory, churches would go down to the bank and they would open up a separate bank account, okay, at the bank for that money that was given for a designated purpose. Well, now that you have church windows accounting, you don't have to go down. You can still deposit the money to, say, your existing checking account, but then if you want to track it separately, set up another fund balance down here under the fund balance accounts. Asset accounts are simply accounts where our money is stored. They're not designed in church windows to be necessarily the accounts that track the money separately. That's what funds do. All right. As I said, in terms of QuickBooks, you can treat this like an accrual system, but just be aware that it doesn't always work out that way. And I point this out noticeably here. We're getting close to our time, folks, so I want to kind of wrap things up here. Is a way that this kind of deviates from cash per se is when we're dealing with, notably, when churches like pass-through accounts, okay? We have money that's coming in that's being for supporting a project that's going to support another nonprofit, say. Like I said, Housing for Habitat or Habitat, for Humanity, or hurricane relief or disaster recovery. The money isn't coming in for the church to use for it's being passed on or handed off to another third-party nonprofit. We don't want to have that money go into our treasurer's report as income or being spent as an expense when its purpose is to be handed off to another nonprofit, okay, to use for their uses, okay? So we will send this money oftentimes from donations directly into these liability accounts, and the money will then deposit into, say, our bank accounts, into our checking account, and it sits there, okay? And then when we go, okay, how much do I have? I've got here $715 for my crop walk that I need to now write a check for them. Well, that's money that's gone into my cash account, but it never hit my treasurer's report. I didn't want it to hit my treasurer's report. And this is what I mean about how where church windows accounting, money given and money being used by churches differs from QuickBooks in terms of how the reporting needs are different, all right? So I would now go into pay bills and quick pay and view vendors with the balance, and I'd write that check out for crop walk, okay? So the only way that I would be able to see that would be right here under reports, worksheets, or in my summary of cash activity, when I can actually look and see what my cash activity is, and it may not all match up with what my treasurer's report shows, okay? We're going to go a couple minutes long here, folks, but the other one that I was talking about was the fund activity report in comparison to what the statement of cash flows, okay? The fund activity report is one of the reports that makes church windows accounting really very unique. We have the detailed report, so it does show each one of our funds, and if I go to the funds tab, here's all of my funds listed over here on the right. Okay, I can isolate one or I can leave them all, but when I choose detailed and I click print, it shows here's my beginning fund balance for either the month or the year. Here's the month or year-to-date activity of income going into the fund. Here are the expenses for the month or the year to date flowing out of the fund. And then I've got the ending fund balance down here at the bottom. Where is it? Down here. And I've got even journal entry debits or credits, meaning those would be transactions directly affecting the fund itself, posting to the fund. They're rare, but they do happen. And then my ending balance. And then I go into my next fund, my building fund, and I do the same. I see the same thing. Income going in, expenses coming out, and net difference at the bottom. Basically, beginning balance plus current year's income minus current year's expenses equals the ending balance for the fund. And those balances would carry forward into the next year automatically. In a nutshell, and I talk about this on the reports before, on my other webinars as well, one of my all-time favorite reports in the software are either consolidated fund activity report for the selected month or year. So if we look at the consolidated year to date horizontal and click print, it tells us exactly what happened in the fund in one single line. Beginning balance for the year, receipts or income, disbursements or expenses, journal entries or transfers in or out of the fund directly, and my current ending balance. And all of that is proven on the actual detailed report. And if I were to go in and run reports like my transaction journal or my general ledger for the fund, all of this activity would be verified exactly.